From the very first moment I laid eyes on Emma, I was convinced she was the woman I'd been waiting for my whole life. She carried herself with a quiet kind of grace, not the flashy, attention-seeking kind, but the type that naturally drew people in. There was something almost uncanny about how seamlessly her intelligence, ambition, and charm aligned with mine, as if we had been crafted from the same mold. She thrived in the fast-paced world of financial consulting, while I navigated the high-stakes realm of luxury hospitality as an executive. Our shared hunger for success and mutual understanding of demanding careers seemed to forge a bond between us. We both knew what it meant to work late, to hop on last-minute flights, to shoulder the relentless pressure of high-level jobs, or at least, I thought we did. In the early years of our marriage, everything felt like it had fallen perfectly into place. No matter how hectic life got, Emma made sure we held on to the small things, the ones that truly mattered. Sunday mornings spent sipping coffee on the patio, impromptu date nights, and the handwritten notes she'd slip into my luggage before a business trip. Those little acts of love made me believe I'd hit the jackpot. I did my best to give back in kind. I planned surprise getaways, took over the kitchen whenever I had the chance, and always made time to listen when she needed to vent about a difficult client or a frustrating day. We were partners, a team, or so I believed. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment I started to place her on a pedestal. It was at a company gala, where she accompanied me as my date. I watched her move effortlessly through the crowd, charming everyone she spoke to. Colleagues leaned in and whispered how lucky I was, and I could only nod, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. Emma wasn't just my wife, she was my equal, my anchor, my forever. But life has a way of knocking you down just when you think you have it all figured out. The cracks in our picture-perfect marriage didn't appear in one big, dramatic moment. They crept in slowly, so quietly that I hardly noticed them at first. Maybe that's how betrayal works, it doesn't announce itself. It lingers in the shadows, slipping into the spaces you'd never think to check until it's already too late. At the time, though, I didn't see those shadows. I only saw her. And I was blind, blind with love, blind with trust. The truth of our marriage was far different from the fantasy I had built in my head. Now, sitting here and retracing every moment, I realize just how naive I had been. It wasn't that I ignored the warning signs, they simply weren't there. Not at first. Emma was perfect, or at least, that was the version of her I allowed myself to believe in. I can't pinpoint the exact moment things shifted, but shift they did. It started in the smallest of ways, so subtle that at first, I convinced myself I was imagining things. She began staying late at the office more often than usual. Given her line of work, this wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but something about it felt different. Before, she would always call or text to let me know, sometimes even apologizing for missing dinner. But then, those messages became fewer, the explanations vaguer. And when she finally did come home, she felt distant, almost like a stranger wearing my wife's face. At first, I told myself it was just stress. We were both drowning in work, and I knew better than anyone how brutal it could be to juggle high-pressure clients, back-to-back meetings, and impossible deadlines. Everyone goes through rough patches, right? No sense in overanalyzing. But then there was the text. It was a Friday night, and we were curled up on the couch, watching one of those true crime shows she loved. Her phone buzzed. I barely noticed it, until I did. The way she snatched it up was anything but casual. It wasn't the usual, mindless glance of someone checking a harmless message. No, this was different. There was a split second of panic in her eyes, a nervous laugh that didn't quite land right. She muted the phone, flipped it face down on the coffee table, and forced her attention back to the TV. "Who's that?" I asked, keeping my voice light, casual. "Just a client," she answered, eyes locked on the screen, avoiding mine. "He's been a bit needy lately." Her explanation sounded reasonable enough, but her body told a different story. Her shoulders were rigid, her fingers clutched her phone a little too tightly. It was just a brief moment, a flicker of something off, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt, one that refused to be ignored. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I wanted to believe her, I needed to, but that doubt had already taken hold, and no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, it wouldn't let go. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Her late nights at the office became more frequent, always conveniently coinciding with missed calls or texts she brushed off as work emergencies. The warmth that had once filled our marriage began to fade, replaced by a cold distance I couldn't explain away. She stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped checking in on my day. It was as if the woman I had built my life with was slowly slipping away, becoming someone I barely recognized. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that maybe she was simply stressed, that maybe she just needed some space, but deep down, I knew better. My gut was screaming at me, and for the first time in our marriage, I couldn't silence the nagging voice telling me something wasn't right. It's strange, the tiny details you start to pick up on when trust begins to crack. The way her smiles no longer reached her eyes. The way she avoided my touch, my gaze. The way our home, once filled with easy conversation and laughter, had grown eerily quiet, even when we were sitting in the same room. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that Emma, the woman I had loved so deeply, could be keeping something from me. But the signs were there, clear as day. And no matter how much I tried to look past them, I knew I couldn't ignore them forever. Something was wrong. And whether I was ready for it or not, I had to find out the truth. That truth came to light on a Friday evening. Emma had just left for another one of her so-called late-night client meetings. I sat alone in our living room, the soft murmur of the TV filling the silence, but my mind wasn't on the screen. The weight of everything that had been building over the past few weeks finally reached its breaking point. I couldn't sit in the dark any longer, I needed answers. That was when I saw it. Her laptop, sitting unattended on the dining table. Emma was usually careful, always making sure to lock her devices, but that night, she must have been in a rush. My hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitation creeping in. Part of me felt guilty, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But then there was the other part, the one that had spent too many nights battling doubt and suspicion. That part pushed me forward. I had to know. I opened her email, and the moment my eyes landed on the screen, my worst fears were confirmed. At first, it was just the usual work correspondence, the kind of professional back and forth you'd expect. But then, as I scrolled further, my breath caught. A thread of messages with a subject line that felt far too personal: dinner plans tonight. My chest tightened. I clicked on the thread, and the second I saw the sender's name, my stomach dropped: Brandon. My heart pounded as I scanned the emails, the words blurring together. These weren't work-related messages. They weren't innocent. Every sentence was another knife to the gut. Brandon wasn't just some random name, he was someone I had met before. A married man. Someone Emma had introduced me to months ago at one of her work events. I could still picture the polite smile he had given me, the firm handshake, the casual small talk. But now, staring at the words on the screen, I realized that behind that carefully maintained facade was a man who had been betraying his own wife while helping mine betray me. Their emails spelled it all out in excruciating detail. Expensive dinners at high-end restaurants. Weekend trips. Intimate plans to meet in boutique hotels. It wasn't just physical. There was something deeper, something even worse, an emotional closeness that made my chest tighten. They weren't just sneaking around behind my back. They had built a world of their own, a space where they laughed together, confided in each other, and escaped the so-called burdens of their marriages. And just like that, the life I thought I had shattered before my eyes, that I felt sick to my stomach. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, the weight of what I'd just discovered pressing down like a vice. My first instinct was to grab my phone, to call Emma right then and there and demand an explanation. But as I stared at the emails, another thought crept into my mind: if she had gone to such lengths to hide this from me, confronting her now wouldn't get me the truth. It would only make her double down on the lies. No, I had to be smarter. I didn't just need an argument, I needed proof, evidence she couldn't twist, deny, or talk her way out of. That night, I sat at her laptop for hours, combing through every email, every conversation, piecing together the full extent of her betrayal. With each message, the picture became clearer, and with it, my hurt turned into something else: determination. Emma had made a fool of me, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she had gotten away with it. She had been living a double life, weaving a web of deception right under my nose. But the betrayal didn't stop with me. There was someone else who had been just as blind to it: Brandon's wife, Isabel. And the moment I realized she was just as unaware as I had been, something inside me shifted. I had all the pieces now. The question was, what was I going to do with them? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark living room, staring at nothing, my mind spinning through the possibilities. Emma thought she had outplayed me, thought she was in control. But she was about to find out just how wrong she was. This wasn't just about confronting her, it was about reclaiming the power she thought she had stolen from me. By the time morning came, the despair had burned away, leaving behind something colder, more focused. The betrayal had cut deep, but I wasn't about to let Emma or Brandon walk away without consequences. They had made their choices, deliberate, selfish choices, to betray the people who had trusted them the most. Now, it was time for them to face what they had done. My first step was hiring a private investigator. If I was going to confront Emma, I needed more than just some emails, I needed hard, irrefutable proof. The investigator I hired came highly recommended, a professional who had handled cases far worse than mine. Over the next few weeks, he fed me everything I needed: photos, timestamps, and video evidence that erased any lingering doubt. Emma and Brandon weren't just having the occasional work dinner. They were sneaking off to hotels, holding hands like love-struck teenagers, sharing intimate moments that made my stomach turn. Every new piece of evidence was like a fresh wound, but it also gave me clarity. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Emma hadn't just betrayed me, she had trampled over everything we had built together. But as I sifted through the proof, another realization hit me. Isabel had no idea. She was living in the same darkness I had been, trusting a man who had been deceiving her at every turn. The irony wasn't lost on me: Brandon, who had been so reckless in pursuing my wife, had no idea his own carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down. For days, I wrestled with the decision to tell Isabel. Would it make things worse for her? Was it my place to be the one to break the news? But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. She deserved to know the truth. No one should be left in the dark, especially when the truth had the power to set them free. So, I made my decision. I gathered everything: the photos, the receipts, the printouts of their email exchanges, and put them together in an anonymous package. Inside, I included a simple note. You deserve to know the truth. If you'd like to talk, you can reach me at this number. Then, I sent it to Isabel. And with that, the first domino fell that I had no idea if Isabel would respond, if she would even believe me, but I hoped she'd see the truth for what it was. A few days later, my phone rang. Her voice was composed, but beneath the surface, I could hear the weight of it all. "This is Isabel," she said. "I got your package." That evening, we met at a quiet cafe. She sat across from me, poised and controlled, but her eyes betrayed the storm she was holding back. As we laid out everything we knew, an odd sense of solidarity settled between us. She had been blindsided just as I had, deceived by the person she trusted most. But what struck me wasn't just her pain, it was her strength. Isabel wasn't someone who broke under pressure. She wasn't here to cry over what was lost. She was here for justice. "I want to confront him," she said, her voice firm, "but I want to do it in a way he'll never forget." Her determination sparked something in me. "What if we do it together?" I suggested. "They think they've gotten away with this. Let's show them they haven't." For the first time that evening, Isabel smiled. "I like the way you think." And just like that, an unlikely alliance was born. Over the next few weeks, we planned meticulously. This wasn't just about catching them in the act, it was about making sure they felt the full force of what they had done. Every detail was calculated, where, when, how, ensuring there would be no escape, no excuses. The stage was set. We weren't just the betrayed spouses anymore, we were the architects of their reckoning. Those weeks felt surreal, almost like I was living someone else's life. Isabel and I worked like two generals preparing for battle. We had strategy meetings in hushed tones, exchanged information in discreet locations, and kept a careful eye on every move Emma and Brandon made. It wasn't about blind rage anymore, it was about taking control of a situation neither of us had asked to be part of. And Isabel? She was incredible. Despite the heartbreak, she refused to let emotions cloud her judgment. She was sharp, methodical, and completely focused on our goal. "They think they're untouchable," she said during one of our meetings, her voice edged with quiet fury. "But they've underestimated us." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie with this woman I had barely known a few weeks ago. "They've been playing games with our lives. Let's remind them of the rules they forgot to follow." We settled on a high-end restaurant downtown, a place Brandon and Emma had turned into their personal playground. It was the perfect setting, upscale, intimate, and just public enough to humiliate them properly. Isabel even managed to secure a table with the perfect vantage point, allowing us to watch the moment their world collapsed around them. Every last detail was planned with precision. But this wasn't just about the public confrontation. I had my own plans for Emma at home. It wasn't enough for her to be caught red-handed, I wanted her to come back to the life she had so easily discarded and feel the weight of her choices. I had divorce papers drafted, ready and waiting. I made arrangements for her to pack her things. The home we had built together, the one she had so effortlessly disrespected, was no longer hers. Isabel, too, was preparing for more than just an emotional reckoning. She wasn't simply confronting Brandon as a betrayed wife, she was ready to dismantle his entire professional life. Through her own contacts, she uncovered damning evidence that Brandon had been misusing company funds to finance his affair. "Let's see how his board feels about their golden boy living a double life," she said, her voice cold, resolute. They had made their choices. Now, it was time for them to face the consequences. The night before the confrontation, I found myself lost in thought, retracing every step that had led to this moment. The love I once had for Emma felt like a distant echo, buried beneath the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. And yet, I couldn't shake the questions circling in my mind. Had I missed something? Was there a moment I could have changed? Was this somehow my fault? But no answers came, only the cold, unwavering truth that this wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about reclaiming my dignity. That night, Isabel and I had one final call before everything unfolded. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said. "What about you?" She hesitated for a moment. "It's not going to be easy," she admitted, "but it's necessary." It struck me then just how much strength it took for both of us to be here. We had been blindsided, humiliated, torn apart by the very people we trusted most. But we hadn't let it break us. Instead, we had turned our pain into resolve, our despair into action. By tomorrow, Emma and Brandon would realize the people they had so carelessly deceived weren't as weak as they had assumed. As I hung up the phone, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The storm was coming, but I was ready to stand in the eye of it. The evening of the confrontation crackled with a tense energy, anticipation thick in the air. Isabel and I arrived at the restaurant early, taking a secluded corner table that offered a perfect view of the entrance. My fingers tightened around my drink, the tremor in my hands barely noticeable. Across from me, Isabel was as poised as ever. She met my gaze, steady and sure. "Stay focused," she murmured. "This is about control." Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, at last, they arrived. Emma and Brandon strolled in hand, their laughter spilling into the room like some twisted melody. She looked radiant, glowing in a way that made my stomach churn. Watching her, it was almost impossible to reconcile the woman I had built a life with and the one standing before me now, draped in deceit and indifference. But then the anger rose, sharp and grounding, reminding me exactly why I was here. We didn't move at first. We let them settle in, lost in their little world, sipping wine and exchanging looks meant for lovers. They leaned into each other, oblivious to the storm looming just a few feet away. It was almost laughable, how secure they seemed, how utterly unaware that their carefully built illusion was about to shatter. When their entrées arrived, Isabel gave me the signal. Together, we rose and crossed the room with purpose. The clink of silverware and murmur of conversation dulled as heads turned, sensing the shift in the air. By the time we reached their table, Emma's laughter had frozen in place. Brandon, mid-sip of his wine, nearly choked when he saw us standing there. I held her gaze, my voice steady but cold. "Emma, you forgot to mention you'd be having dinner with Brandon tonight." The color drained from her face. "Ethan, I can explain." "You'll have plenty of time to explain," I cut in, pulling a folder from my bag and placing it firmly on the table. "These are the divorce papers. You have 10 minutes to sign them, pack your things, and get out of my house." Her mouth parted, but no words came. She stared at the papers as if they were written in a language she couldn't understand. "Divorce?" she choked out, as if the idea was completely foreign to her. "You're being ridiculous." I let out a sharp laugh, devoid of humor. "Ridiculous?" My voice edged higher, raw with disbelief. "What's ridiculous is you throwing away our marriage for this." I gestured toward Brandon, who suddenly looked very interested in his plate. Isabel wasn't one to be overshadowed. She turned to Brandon, her expression carved from ice. "And you, Brandon? I see you've been keeping yourself busy." Her voice was smooth, lethal. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" The restaurant had fallen into near silence now, the air thick with second-hand embarrassment. Eyes darted between us, forks paused midair, conversations forgotten. Emma and Brandon were exposed, trapped in a moment they hadn't prepared for. And this? This was only the beginning. Brandon made a feeble attempt to stand, but Isabel's hand landed firmly on his shoulder, pushing him back down. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice even but firm. "We're far from done." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, placing it beside mine on the table. "Your company's board will be receiving this first thing Monday morning," she said, her tone as sharp as a blade. "Let's see how they feel about their CFO using company funds to wine and dine his mistress." Brandon's face drained of color. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I would," Isabel cut in smoothly, her lips curling into a cold smile. "And I will." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every set of eyes in the room was locked onto us, the hushed murmur of speculation hanging thick in the air. Emma and Brandon sat frozen, their masks slipping, as the weight of the moment crashed down on them. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief, like I could finally breathe again. I leaned in slightly, my voice low but firm. "You thought I wouldn't notice, Emma. You thought I wouldn't piece together the lies, the late nights, the deception. You underestimated me, and that's on you. With that, Isabel and I turned on our heels and walked away, leaving them to stew in their humiliation. As we stepped out into the cool night air, a wave of emotions washed over me: anger, closure, and a strange, unexpected sense of liberation. The battle had ended exactly as planned. But the war? That was still unfolding. The real consequences began later that night. Emma came home looking shaken, her usual composure shattered. She didn't even try to deny it this time. Instead, she broke down, begging, pleading, crying. Her voice cracked with desperation, but I felt nothing. The man she had once been able to reach no longer existed. I warned you, I said, my voice steady, emotionless. You had a choice, Emma. And you made it. Now you have to live with it. I handed her the divorce papers again, this time leaving no room for argument. Sign them. Pack your things. You don't live here anymore. Tears streamed down her face, her hands trembling as she clutched the papers. Maybe, for the first time, she was realizing that actions had consequences. Maybe her regret was real. But it didn't matter anymore. Regret couldn't undo betrayal. By morning, I had the locks changed. Her belongings were packed and sent to her parents' house. She called. She texted. Message after message filled my phone: apologies, explanations, desperate attempts to fix the unfixable. I ignored them all. She even showed up at my office once, only to be turned away by security. Every attempt she made to pull me back into her web only hardened my resolve. Forgiveness was not an option. Brandon's downfall was swift and merciless. Isabel made good on her promise, delivering the evidence to his company's board. The allegations of financial misconduct, combined with the scandal of his affair, were more than enough to seal his fate. Within days, he was fired. The news spread like wildfire, tarnishing his reputation in both his professional and social circles. Isabel called me the day after his termination. It's done, she said simply. There was no gloating, no lingering satisfaction in her voice, just quiet finality. He's out. But Isabel wasn't finished. She wasted no time filing for divorce, severing every tie that bound her to Brandon. He had spent years living a life of privilege, convinced he was untouchable. Now, stripped of his job, his reputation, and his marriage, his world crumbled around him. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had been forced to move into a cramped apartment, a far cry from the luxury he once flaunted. The man who had so confidently pursued my wife, who had laughed in secret with her about the burdens of marriage, had lost everything. And while Emma and Brandon were left picking up the broken pieces of their own making, Isabel and I? We were moving forward. Emma's life didn't fare much better. She had severely underestimated just how much she stood to lose in the divorce. My lawyer, ruthless in exactly the way I needed him to be, made sure she walked away with far less than she had expected. She tried to fight it, but with the overwhelming evidence stacked against her, there was no real battle to be won. Her reputation took a hit as well. The friends she once surrounded herself with began to pull away, unwilling to be associated with someone whose betrayal had become so public. And yet, despite everything, I didn't feel victorious. This had never been about revenge, it was about justice. It was about ensuring that those who had betrayed us didn't get to simply walk away unscathed. Emma and Brandon had made their choices, and now they had to live with them. That was enough. What struck me most, though, was the unexpected strength Isabel and I found in each other. We stayed in touch, checking in, offering support as we navigated the wreckage of our marriages. There was no romance between us, just a quiet understanding, a bond forged in shared pain. Together, we focused on rebuilding, one step at a time. Betrayal had broken us at first, but in the end, it only made us stronger. And that strength? That was the real victory. The days and weeks following the confrontation felt surreal, like I had stepped into an entirely new life. The house, once filled with Emma's presence, was now eerily quiet, but it was also lighter, free of the weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe without the suffocating presence of doubt and deception lingering in the air. But peace didn't come overnight. The remnants of my life with her were everywhere, reminders of what had been and what would never be again. Her calls and texts didn't stop immediately. Every day, there was a new message, some dripping with remorse, others laced with anger, and a few so desperate they barely felt like they came from the same person. At first, I read them, not because I wanted to, but out of a strange curiosity. It was almost like watching someone go through the stages of grief in real time. She cycled through regret, blame, denial. But the more I read, the more I realized something. These messages weren't for me. They were for the life she had lost, the comfort and stability she had thrown away for meaningless thrills. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry for the consequences. That was when I stopped reading altogether. I deleted every message without a second thought. By then, my lawyer had already made it clear to hers, any communication between us would go through legal channels. There was nothing left to say. No apology or explanation could undo the damage she had caused. The divorce process moved quickly. With the evidence in my favor, there was no room for drawn-out negotiations. Within months, it was finalized. Emma walked away with far less than she had hoped, though it was her pride that took the biggest hit of all. Brandon's downfall was even more spectacular. Isabel had made sure of that. She was relentless, ensuring that every damning piece of evidence reached the right people. His termination wasn't just a quiet exit, it made headlines in his industry, shattering his carefully constructed image. The elite social circles he and Emma had once reveled in turned cold, the whispers and judgment spreading like wildfire. I later heard that Emma had tried reaching out to him once their respective worlds had crumbled. But Brandon, now too busy scrambling to salvage what little he had left, wanted nothing to do with her. During those weeks, Isabel and I kept in touch. We weren't friends in the traditional sense, but we shared something deeper, a connection few others could understand. We had walked through hell side by side, emerging not unscathed, but stronger. One day, she told me, confronting Brandon was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was also the most freeing. I understood that feeling completely. We had taken back control of our lives, lives that had been hijacked by deceit. And in doing so, we had found something neither of us had expected. Peace.as for Emma and Brandon, their downward spiral only continued. Brandon, once a man who thrived on wealth and influence, now found himself living in a modest apartment, worlds away from the luxury he had once paraded so confidently. Emma, too, faced the slow unraveling of everything she had taken for granted. Her social and professional circles shrank by the day, as whispers of her betrayal spread. She had burned bridges she hadn't even realized she would need, and by the time she did, it was too late to rebuild them. But if their lives had crumbled, mine wasn't without its struggles either. Rebuilding after betrayal is no simple task. It's a slow, uneven process, filled with moments of anger, sadness, and inevitable self-doubt. There were nights when the weight of everything threatened to pull me under, when I questioned how I had missed the signs, or why I hadn't seen the truth sooner. But then there were moments of clarity, brief but powerful, where I saw Emma for who she had truly become, not the woman I had once loved. That woman was long gone, a shadow of someone who no longer existed. Letting go of that illusion was painful, but it was necessary. In the quiet of my home, now mine in every sense, I found comfort in the small things. Books that had sat unread on my shelves for years. Music that soothed something raw inside me. Long walks that cleared my mind. Piece by piece, I began rediscovering myself, realizing that I wasn't defined by Emma's betrayal. My life was bigger than the wreckage she had left behind. Isabel and I had ensured one thing: Emma and Brandon would never forget the consequences of their choices. But true victory wasn't in their downfall. It was in our ability to move forward, to become stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. Healing after betrayal isn't a single act, it's a series of small, deliberate choices, each one bringing you closer to the person you're meant to be. For weeks, it felt like I was learning to walk again, trying to navigate a world where Emma no longer existed. The house, once filled with echoes of her laughter and presence, was now almost eerily quiet, but for the first time, that silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like space. Space to reflect. Space to rebuild. The first step was reclaiming my home. I redecorated, swapping out furniture and artwork that carried too many memories of her. It was a symbolic act, small but significant. Each change, whether it was rearranging a room or replacing an old photograph, felt like I was taking back a part of myself that had been lost in the chaos. Some of our shared belongings, I donated to charity. Others, I packed away, unable to keep them but not quite ready to throw them out either. The house, once a monument to our marriage, was transforming, slowly but surely, into something else. Something mine. Work became my refuge. Throwing myself into my career helped me regain a sense of purpose and control. The long hours that once felt like an obligation now became a welcome escape. My colleagues noticed the shift, commenting on my renewed energy and focus. They didn't know the details of what had happened, and I preferred it that way. This wasn't about seeking pity or sympathy. It was about proving, to myself more than anyone, that I could not only survive this but come out of it better, stronger. During this time, Isabel and I continued to check in on each other. Our conversations were never lengthy or overly sentimental, just practical updates, the occasional exchange of advice, or a quiet word of encouragement when one of us needed it. Despite everything she had been through, Isabel carried herself with the same grace and determination she always had. She wasn't just surviving, she was rebuilding, just like I was. Her divorce was finalized shortly after mine. We didn't discuss it much, but I knew, just as I had felt it, there was a bittersweet relief in finally closing that chapter. One evening, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was Isabel. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "I'm doing better," I admitted. "Just taking it one day at a time." "Good," she said, her voice warm but steady. "You deserve better than what they put us through. Don't ever forget that." Her words lingered long after we hung up. They were a quiet but powerful reminder that while Emma and Brandon had shattered our trust and upended our lives, they didn't define us. Their betrayal wasn't our legacy. We were more than the pain they had caused, and the only way forward was to truly believe that. Of course, there were still moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the house was silent and my thoughts ran unchecked, I found myself questioning everything. Had I missed the signs? Could I have done something differently? But as time passed, those questions lost their grip on me. The answers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had survived, that I had come out the other side stronger than I ever thought possible. Rebuilding my social life was its own challenge. After the divorce, many of the mutual friends Emma and I had shared seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. Some drifted away, hesitant to take sides or get involved. I didn't hold it against them. Loyalty is a complicated thing when betrayal fractures a circle. But I also didn't let it weigh me down. Instead, I shifted my focus. I put my energy into meeting new people, forming connections that weren't tied to my past with Emma. It wasn't always easy, starting over rarely is, but it was necessary. And slowly, step by step, I found myself stepping into a life that felt lighter, freer, and entirely my own.